This interview with Mimi Ito is under the auspices of the Maria Rogers Oral History Program and the Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry project of the University of Colorado Jewish Studies Department. It is November 12th, 2010. We are in Boulder, Colorado. I am Shirley Steele. Liz McCutcheon is filming. Mimi is also going to talk about her late mother, Harriet Moskovit, who was a part of the BASJ as a host family. Mimi, to start, where and when were you born, and where did you grow up?
Well, I actually was born in France. So both my parents are and were American, but they were in France, and I was there for about 6 months, and then we came here, and I grew up till approximately 12, the age of 12 in California, and then we moved here to Colorado. So I've been here for a long time. I did a few times move away for short periods of time. I was in Japan for 2 years. But I've been back in Boulder since 1987, just shortly before I started working with BASJ.
You had a spread out childhood, so I was wondering, did your family have any connection with the Judaism as you moved around? What was it like in your family?
In California, when we were living there, we didn't know a lot of other Jewish people. My mother always taught me to be very proud of being Jewish, and she did good jobs. It worked. And my father too, but especially my mother. And also she taught me a very strong love for Israel, the home of the Jewish people, and charity work, doing work to help people, and especially Jewish people in need. Now, I've done charity work, not just with the Jewish community, but that of course is especially important for us.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to undergraduate school at CU, at University of Colorado, and then I went to CSU, Colorado State University, for 2 years and got a master's in linguistics and teaching English as a second language mainly.
So that was, you did as a profession then?
Yes, then I worked for many years as an English teacher. When my husband and I were in Texas for 7 years, I taught there at the university, and I taught at the University of Denver, and also at Front Range Community College it's now in Longmont, but in Boulder County.
The experience of teaching would have been with English-speaking students?
Most of my experience was with non-native speakers of English, so teaching them how to speak English, and most of my jobs I was working with students who wanted to get into the university. They had graduated from high school in their own countries, but their English wasn't quite good enough. And they ranged from beginning to advanced, so sometimes they had very little English, and actually some of my favorite classes were with the beginners. I guess because you could see so much progress, and also the teacher is teacher, psychologist, mother, nurse, friend, everything combined.
I want to talk more about English as a second language, but just before we get there, were you at all involved in activism in terms of protesting or civil rights or things like that?
Well, in the 70s, I was in the university at CU, and I did take part in some marches. Nowadays, let's say in the last 10, 20 years, I have done that. The BASJ work is activism, not marching on the streets, but activism. And as I said, I have done a number of different charity or volunteer kinds of work. I did a lot of work with children. I worked with most recently with children and adults, women who'd been abused, battered women, and their children, but a lot of different things like that. And I have always remembered my mother's love for Israel, and which she passed on to me. I have it now too. And everyone in my family would often write letters to the editor about Israel, and I've done work for a number of organizations to support Israel.
So you were ready for the BASJ when it came along?
Actually, it was my mother who told me about
Okay.
it because she knew Bill Cohen, and she said, you know, they're teaching English to the immigrants coming over from what was then Soviet Union, and could probably use your help. So that's how I got involved.
What was your actual job title?
Oh, I don't know if there was a title,
okay.
but what I did with one other teacher was we taught the volunteers how to help the immigrants with teaching them English, helping them to learn English, as well as helping them to navigate the community, learning about American culture and how to do things in an American city.
Was your mother working for BASJ then too?
Well, I started first, and she was in one of the first few classes that we had for volunteers because I told my parents about it and she wanted to get involved. And my mother was working as a lawyer, but she always, you know, had interest in activism and doing good works, and so she very happily came and took one of the first classes, and it was an unusual circumstance for me to be teaching my mother.
So her work with the New Americans, I'm going to use New Americans, that term.
Okay.
Would be with the tutoring, or was she a host family? Or?
Well, she was I guess you could call a tutor for a new family, and she worked particularly with the woman in the family. And so she first started with teaching or helping her with English. A lot of the New Americans were taking English classes somewhere in the community, but they certainly needed help sometimes outside of the class. And the woman that she worked with did know some English. She wasn't a beginner, but she helped her with English. And then they became friends, and, you know, our families did a number of things together. I remember that, so I will give the woman a name so I don't keep saying she. We'll call her Ellen. And my mother worked with Ellen primarily, but Ellen, her husband was here and her mother also. And I remember going over to Ellen's house once with my mother, and once we made hamantaschen, and they were very good. I still have the recipe. And then also they came to our house for Thanksgiving once, and the mother, Ellen's mother, was in her 90s, I think, and it was rather sad because she could not speak English very much at all, and I think she thought that she was too old to learn, and so she really never learned much English. But from what Ellen told us, she was really very intelligent and had been done good works in when she was back home. She had been active in her career. But at Thanksgiving, I invited a friend of mine who speaks Russian also. And she came alive, her face lit up, and it was just so wonderful to see. She was so happy at that time. I remember that.
It sort of reminds me, as did people talk about what went on and what was going on in Russia before they left?
We didn't talk about it a lot. I think that we mostly felt that it should be left to the New Americans whether they wanted to talk about it or not. I just remember hearing, I heard stories here and there, either personally from the New Americans or from their volunteers. I heard about one family, and they just had one thing happen after another to members of their family. They were threatened, and there were they were members beaten up and things like that, and they finally said, you know, we've got to get out of here. So they left. Yeah.
Did they have trouble getting out?
Yes. Bill Cohen went to the former Soviet Union a number of times, I remember, to help things. At the time that BASJ came into existence was a time, though, that it was more open, the freedom to leave. And so it was not as hard as it had been in the past, but I don't think it was very easy. I know that the New Americans had to leave with just a very small number of belongings. They had to leave a lot of things, and they couldn't bring much money. And so, you know, I can only imagine how difficult that would be, to leave your country and your home and to have to just take a small number of mementos with you. And so the anti-Semitism there had to have been very, very difficult if they would leave their families. And most of the families we had came from Dushanbe, where it was particularly bad. In some other parts of Russia, it was maybe bad, but not as bad. But most of them came from there. That's the sister city of Boulder. You know.
We hear about that at Dushanbe in other interviews too. I'm just getting back to the English as a second language. Just for historical accuracy, could you quickly explain or briefly explain what it is?
Well, English as a second language is
The
what is the what?
The program.
Oh, the program that through BASJ?
Yeah.
Well, I'll try to remember. It has been about 30 years now. The other teacher and I set up a program, and I believe we had about 5 different classes that the volunteers had to go through. And it was primarily teaching English. Well, maybe it was about half teaching English and half how to help them with, let's say you had to go to the dentist, what do you do? You know, things like that. How to use a phone book, you know. All these things are different. And I do remember there was also, the New Americans were afraid of the police, understandably so. The government and the police back at home had not been their friends, and helping to teach them that it was pretty different here. You know, there's so many different things. And of course, a lot of the things that they had to learn, we couldn't teach in the 5-part class, it was just as they come up kind of thing. But I remember that I taught in particular a class on grammar, some of the most common grammar problems and how to help the students when they had grammar problems.
Let me interrupt for a minute. When you're talking about teaching a class, the class was made up of other tutors, or the class was made up of New Americans?
Oh, okay. The class was made up of the American volunteers who would then, in the future, work as tutors and helpers to the New Americans. And I think we had about 8 or 10, 12 people per class. And then another time I did a lesson on listening, and especially on fast American speech, I called it. Because we say things like, what you doing? And that could be hard for a non-native speaker. What does that, what's cha? What is that word? So things like that. And in 5 lessons, we really couldn't, you know, make them English teachers, but we at least gave them a start. And I know I heard later that some of them didn't do any English teaching with their students, but others did. My mother, for example, would, she was a very good student, and she would call me sometimes and say, you know, I need some material for my lesson today, you know, I want to do such and such, and I'd help her with what she was going to do. I remember in particular there's a book that has, it's for stimulating conversation, and it has on every page 2 pictures. You've seen this kind of thing in the newspaper. and the two pictures are very similar, but they have a few differences, and you have to pick out the differences. So she would use those for stimulating conversation, and then I'd copy some from my book for her to use. I remember that. And then they had a good time. And my mother was friends with Ellen, you know, all of the rest of her life, and Ellen stayed in the Boulder area for quite a while until she moved out east to be near one of her daughters. But my mother and I also went to Israel to visit her other daughter, and we had a very nice time with her daughter. You know, we'd never met her before, and then my mother went back to Israel with my father and not with me a few years later, and saw her again and had a nice time again. So we got to know the whole, we got to know all of the family, and yeah.
With your tutors, would they have just worked intensively with one family, or would they see another family, or would they have classes, or?
Well, they worked mostly one-on-one with one person in the family, and not really a class. And you know, they work with one person, but of course get to know the other people in the family from visiting the family, but working one-on-one to help that person mostly.
Do you think it was effective?
Yes, I think it was, because I heard things here and there from the new Americans over the years, and I think that personal connection is especially important, because there were some free English classes in the community, and so some of the new Americans went to those classes. But if you're going to a place where you don't know anyone, and you don't know the culture, and you don't know the language very well, that personal connection is so important. And if the volunteer didn't know how to deal with some problem, they would call one of us on the board, you know, and somebody would work that out. I was part of the board, and we met, I think it was once a month, long meetings, and a lot of things would get worked out. So, for example, if the new American needed to see a doctor, and you know, they didn't have a lot of money, because many of them came here and they had professional jobs, and then they had to work in something like you know, the grocery store, or something that was not their chosen field. And so they didn't have a lot of money. And so we'd work it out to get a discount, for example, through a certain doctor or a dentist or something.
Who else was on the board with you?
Well, Shirley Weiss, she was the other teacher that I worked with, and Barbara Gould, and Bill Cohen, Mike Kreitzman, and I might be forgetting, Murray Richtel. I could be forgetting somebody, but there were around 5, 6, 7 of us, something like that.
I'm kind of hearing you saying that it took a lot of your time.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. In a way, you know, when we weren't doing the classes for the volunteer tutors, then I wasn't doing as much. But during the class, well, once I prepared the classes as a teacher, if you teach something and then you teach it again, it's much easier the second time, because you've already put together the materials, even though things come up in each new class that are different. But it's been a long time. I can't remember that it, you know, was it taking a lot of my time? Maybe. I do still have the materials I used in that class.
Did you have set hours, or it was just on call?
Well, the board meetings were scheduled at a certain time, and what other thing that, of course, that I did was Shirley and I went with each new volunteer to their family, to the person they were going to work with in the family's home the very first time, to introduce everybody. And when we did that, almost every time we were all given food, that is Shirley and me and the new volunteer. And I remember particularly one time that I had eaten dinner just before going, which was a mistake, because then when we got there, they were having dinner, the family, and you've got to eat something with us, you have to, come on. perfect Jewish mothers eat. And so I had to eat another light meal. I didn't eat too much, but they always wanted to feed us. That was a sign of love. And so I learned not to eat before going.
Did you match up a volunteer with a family, or did it just sort of hit or miss?
Well, we did take into consideration the volunteer and something about their likes and dislikes and personality and the person that they were matched with. And as far as I can remember, it went very well. Perhaps it would have gone well if they'd been matched with anyone because they really needed somebody to help them. I don't know, but I don't remember too many times when it seemed that a volunteer and a new American were just really badly matched.
That was what I was kind of getting at.
So I think it went pretty well.
What do you think was the important thing to make it go well? The important criteria?
I would say it was just our motivation, that is all the volunteers and the board and the volunteers to do something good, because most of the volunteers were Jewish. They weren't all Jewish, but most of them were, and we all knew that, as they say, there but for fortune go you or I. We could have been in that position, and we were lucky to be Americans, and most Jews are taught that it's important to help other people, and so we got a lot of joy out of doing that and helping people, just as we would have liked to have been helped if we'd been in that position.
Do you remember any particular lessons or concepts that were maybe difficult or not difficult for students?
The concepts of learning English?
Oh, a particular concept within learning English. You said one when talking fast.
Right. The fast English. Well, verb tenses were always a little difficult, and I can understand as I speak and study French, and verb tenses in one language are not exactly equal to those in another language, and since they're so common, you have to use a verb in almost every sentence. That could be tricky. I do remember some of the volunteer Americans asking me for help with that. I'm trying to help her with the difference between I run and I'm running, and she's not quite getting it. How can I help her? Something like that. So I remember that one as well as the fast speech.
It's a different type too. Was it hard for them to learn the alphabet?
Oh yes, a different writing, yes. I think the alphabet was not so difficult. I don't remember, but perhaps they'd studied English in school, and so at least the writing system was not so difficult, I don't think. Most of them were not total beginners in English when they came over here.
Did they speak Yiddish?
Some of them did. I remember Ellen's mother spoke some Yiddish, and I don't know if they all did. And of course, for the adults, it was harder to learn English. I remember one family, very nice family, and it was, 5 or 6 people, and the daughter was about 6 when she first came, and I remember playing with her when we went to visit the family, and she was a very cute, delightful child, but I couldn't speak a word of Russian to her, and she couldn't speak English. A year later, she had perfect English, and I think it was difficult then for her parents, who didn't have perfect English, to see the daughter being able to do that. They were able to get by, but they didn't have perfect English as she did. But the last I heard, she was in college, and but of course that was probably some time ago. So, yeah.
It would be. She'd have to do some help with translations with them.
Yeah, I think she did. I think that happened in quite a few families, actually, that the children had to help the parents. Yeah.
Do you remember any stories that you heard about the adjustment of children in school?
I did hear one story which was rather scary. I mean, in identifying with the child, it was a little boy, and not sure how old he was, perhaps somewhere between 8 and 14, somewhere in there. And boys sometimes do this pants thing where they pull down the little boy's pants, and I'm not a boy, so I haven't ever experienced that, but I'm sure it's awkward for any boy. It's not fun, but it's not the end of the world. For this boy, he was terribly afraid that because in Russia, you pull down the boys' pants to see if they're circumcised, and if they're circumcised, you know they're Jewish, and then anti-Semitism can follow. So he was extremely scared because of that, and that's one of those cultural things where I'm sure the boys who did it to him only were doing what they often do to other little boys, and it didn't mean anything as scary as it was for him. But I really felt for him, and I think then people in our program explained to him afterwards probably that, you know, it wasn't quite as scary as he was thinking, that's something you don't have to worry about here. So, but that's a kind of cultural problem that that could happen.
Would you have to go to school sometime to intervene?
No, that wasn't my job, so I did. If there was anything like that, I didn't do it.
It's one of the, who would do it? Maybe social worker.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember hearing about anything like that problem at school. You know, I think most of the families, the children and the adults were very eager to fit in and become new Americans and do the best they could. So I don't think I don't remember hearing about any problems at school.
I know you don't have a whole list of where people went or anything like that, but do you remember, did they mostly stay around Boulder, or did they leave?
Well, in the first several years, quite a number of the new Americans were living in North Boulder, and then a good number of them moved to Louisville and Lafayette when they got more money and bought a house. And my mother's, the new American that my mother worked with was Ellen, and she moved to the East Coast to live near her daughter after 10 or 15 years maybe. So she was here in the area for at least that long that my mother was seeing her. And actually after, at a certain time, Ellen didn't feel that she needed the English help anymore, but my mom and Ellen would still see each other as friends. But then she moved to the East Coast. So I know some of them who moved away, but I think a number of them, I think, still live in the area, Boulder County, maybe not Boulder itself.
You mentioned something about not needing the English anymore, and I was thinking about how would you know that how would they know that they didn't?
Oh, not needing the English. She needed English, but not needing the English help, I guess. Yeah. I think it was just a decision by her, the new American, that she didn't really need it as much. She was doing what she needed to do, and she understood the American community much better. And
what kinds of questions did they have that you remember being
questions on new Americans?
Yes. About the culture that they were in.
I think, you know, from what I remember, so I don't remember, it's been such a long time, things like, how do I do this? How do I do that? Just a simple thing like when you want to call someone, you want to call some company, or you want to call the police or social services, you have to know something about the phone book. For example, say you wanted to call the police, you have to know 911, or you have to know the particular section of the phone book to look in. There's simple things like that that we don't think about. And I mentioned, you know, things about getting to see a doctor or a dentist with a discounted rate. how to get from one place to another. I think some of the volunteers would help the new Americans by going with them on the bus the first time, so that they knew exactly how to do, how to get a transfer, how to pull the cord when they wanted to get off, or whatever's involved in taking the bus. I remember hearing about that a few times. And then the second time they could do it by themselves, but so that they could get around town, because at first they didn't have a car.
Yeah, so they really need to learn how to read the bus schedule too.
Right, right. How to get a bus schedule, how to read it, how to take the bus, how to know where to get off, everything involved.
The volunteers that I'm hearing you talk about seemed to be enthusiastic and stayed with their families. Did you have any who didn't?
Well, in one or two cases it just didn't work out. I guess. Now that it's about 30 years later, I don't know how many people still have contact. I don't know. But I did know, for example, another family I can think of, and this family had two volunteers, one for the man, one for the woman, and the volunteers stayed in contact for many, many years, and then one of the volunteers moved out of state, but still wrote letters sometimes to the family, and the other volunteer, I believe, is not in contact, but she stayed in contact for a very long time. So I think that was more the norm, that they stayed in contact for quite a while. Whether they're still in contact now, 30 years later, I don't know, and some of the people moved.
Well, you might not be in contact with a neighbor 30 years later.
Right.
So that speaks well for the relationship. Do you remember any happy stories? We had the story of the little boy. The little girl who learned perfect English within a year. That was great, and she was always so happy anyway, even before she learned English. I think the happy stories, I can't think of a particular, like, one happy incident or something. Well, actually, except for the Thanksgiving, when Ellen's mother was able to speak to someone in Russian. But I think, in general, the happiness is that with time, they adapted to American culture, and they have jobs, and they're making money, that when they moved from apartments in Boulder, say, to a house in Lafayette or Erie, I think that's a very happy occasion, that they were able to blend in and move up, so that they were able to buy a house. And I heard that in a number of cases, quite a few cases. That would be a big thing.
Yeah, I think that is a big thing.
Did they own houses in the Soviet Union?
I don't really know. My guess would be that whatever they did own, it was smaller than houses here, but I don't really remember that.
I think that owning a house must have meant a great deal.
Yeah.
To them. Did they ever talk to you about wanting to go back?
Well, I heard the new Americans sometimes talk about missing the former Soviet Union, but never about going back, because it was just too dangerous there, the anti-Semitism, and too unpredictable. And a lot of them, of course, came because they wanted to give their children a better life and more opportunities. So this little boy, for example, that had the pantsing occasion, I don't know where he is now, but I'm guessing he's the well-adjusted American, and not having those, he's not afraid every day that somebody's going to come and beat him up because he's Jewish, or threaten his brother, or something like that.
I think maybe we need to take a short break.
Okay.
We were talking about the English as a second language, but as a big part of the Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry. And I'm wondering, how do you feel sitting in today in 2010 about that program as a whole, how it affected people, how it affected you.
I think that the program was just invaluable. I think that all of us, the volunteers, had a huge positive effect on the new Americans. Not only were they helped to adapt to the American culture and to speak English better, but there were a lot of friendships forged, especially between the new Americans and the American volunteers that worked with them. And I can say again that I can only imagine how difficult it would be to uproot myself and my family and move to another country where I didn't know the language well and adapt to another culture, and to have that personal connection is just so important. For example, with this family that my mother worked with, Ellen's family, after the family had been here several years, Ellen's mother died, and my mother and I both went to the funeral service with Ellen and sat with her and comforted her. And she, knew some people, but she hadn't been here a huge amount of time. And for, excuse me, I'm sorry. Her husband died. Her mother died, but that was later. Her husband died, and we went to the service, and I just can only imagine how hard it would have been for her to go through that kind of alone. A lot of people came. A lot of people from the Jewish community came and supported her at the funeral service, but my mother and I were the personal connections that were there, and I'm very proud of the work that I did, and I'm sure everybody else, the volunteers, are too. Mm-hmm. And we all got something out of it. When we helped the new Americans, we felt good too. So it was just a win-win solution for everybody involved. And I think it was very important what we did.
And why did it stop? Why did the BASJ stop?
Well, as I understand, there were periods of time when more people were allowed out of the former Soviet Union, and so that's when we worked in the period when a lot of people were coming out, and then not so many people came out, and then the former Soviet Union was not there anymore, became just Russia. So, and I don't remember how long BASJ was in operation. Bill would be the one to know that, but we worked with the time period when a lot of immigrants were coming out.
So you were there when you were needed.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Then things changed.
And we still have interest in helping. So, for example, I know one of the women who came over with BASJ, one of the new Americans, and she's working at a local grocery store, and I see her regularly when I shop, and she told me that she has trouble getting home after her work at the grocery store. On Sunday, there isn't bus service to where she lives, and so I've been inquiring, trying to see if I can get her some help. So I feel like I'm still doing the work in a way. I mean, I'm choosing to because it's a difficult situation for her. So I've been looking around in the Jewish community, and I haven't found anybody yet, but I'm sure I will. I'm pretty sure that I will find something that will help her.
And she wasn't shy about telling you.
I guess not. She told me.
So
but I don't think she told me because she thought I could help her. She told me because we were talking about that. And then but I did tell her I would try to help her, and she said, "Oh, that'd be great." So
that's a nice carryover after 30
yeah,
years.
Yeah.
Did your how would your mother evaluate the program? You told me about the pleasures of it.
Yes, I know that she got a lot of joy out of working with Ellen and helping her, and probably also because I was involved. So it was, in a way, a three-way project to some extent, because she could talk to me about how to help Ellen with English. And then, of course, she and Ellen also included me on a number of things, as I said, making the hamantaschen for Purim and and the Thanksgiving dinner and things. My mother, I don't remember specific things that she said about it, but I remember her joy, and it gave her a lot of pleasure to do this work, and then to become friends with Ellen. And once Ellen moved to the East Coast, they still communicated with letters, and my mother would always send Ellen and her daughter, the one we'd visited in Israel, Hanukkah cards and high holiday cards and things like that, and they'd write and tell each other what was going on. And so I know it gave her a lot of pleasure, and I think it was both having the new friend, but also the being able to help her and be able to do something good.
I have, since that particular project stopped, have you had any experience working with any other groups? I don't even know if there are other groups.
Oh, other
that
groups
have come in,
of New Americans?
Of New Americans that have come in from other
I
places.
don't know, and I haven't done any other work. Yeah, I don't know that.
And what did you do after the BASJ halted?
Well, at that time, I was working, still teaching English, and I think that was when I was teaching at the University of Denver, I believe. And so I continued teaching there, and then for a number of years, and then I moved closer to home and worked at Front Range Community College and teaching Americans. And then I also taught, they had a TESOL program, and teaching, it was the same kind of thing actually, teaching volunteers, not volunteers, teaching Americans who wanted to be English as a second language teachers. So they had a whole program there. I was in on the beginning of the program and helped form that program and taught people who were going to become English as a second language teachers. So that was interesting.
And that would be sort of similar to what you had been doing.
Similar, but we did, of course, a lot more work with them. They weren't looking necessarily to be volunteers. Some of them went overseas, and some worked in the United States after they did the program. They got a certificate after they finished that program. So
I think that you've really covered your work. I'm wondering if there's something you'd like to add that I forgot to ask.
Well, so I suppose the people in Boulder will see this interview and the others from people with the BASJ, and I would hope that they would get out of it how much a dedicated group, small group, can do to enrich other people's lives, and that they could do the same thing in other areas.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful way of ending it. Thank you very much, Mimi.
Thank you.